If you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because what we're about to cover is the story that explains almost everything else. The offshore accounts, the cartels, the dark money, the casino skims. All of it connects back to one man, one system, and one era in American history that most people have never fully understood. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's go. Here is what most people think when they hear the word mob. They think of The Godfather. They think of men in expensive suits sitting around tables in the back of Italian restaurants, speaking in low voices about things that are not written down. They think of Marlon Brando and Al Pacino and the specific aesthetic of a certain kind of mid-century American crime. Formal, hierarchical, rooted in Sicilian tradition, operating according to a code that has its own internal logic and its own internal justice. This picture is real, but it is incomplete, and the part it leaves out is arguably the most important part. The American mob did not become what it became because of the men with guns. It became what it became because of one man with a ledger. A small, quiet, unremarkable-looking man who sat in the corner booth of a diner on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach every morning, read the newspaper, and was being photographed from across the street by FBI agents who had been assigned to watch him for 40 years and had never produced a single successful prosecution. His name was Meyer Lansky. And if you want to understand organized crime in America, not the mythology of it, but the actual financial and organizational structure of it, the architecture that made it durable and profitable and extraordinarily difficult to prosecute, you need to understand him. Lansky was born in 1902 in what is now Belarus, into a poor Jewish family in a poor part of the Russian Empire. He came to America in 1911, 9 years old, speaking no English, landing in a Manhattan neighborhood so dense with other immigrant families that the streets themselves seemed to be made of people rather than pavement. He was small and quiet, and exceptionally good at mathematics, not in the way that gets you gold stars in school, but in the specific, applied way that lets you look at a situation and immediately understand the numbers underneath it. On the Lower East Side, this kind of intelligence had exactly one obvious application: gambling. And in the dice games and card games that ran in the tenements and on the street corners of his neighborhood, Lansky found what he was looking for. Not just money, but something more satisfying than money. He found that he could see things other people couldn't see, that the numbers told him things, that the system, whatever system it was, always had a structure underneath it that could be understood, mapped, and used. He was 13 years old when he met Benjamin Siegel. Siegel was everything Lansky was not: tall, handsome, explosive, the kind of person who walked into a room and changed its temperature. Lansky was everything Siegel was not: patient, analytical, invisible. Together they were complete. And together, across the next 3 decades, they built something that neither could have built alone. Prohibition changed everything. The federal government made alcohol illegal, and overnight, whoever could supply it stood to make almost incomprehensible amounts of money. Lansky understood not just the opportunity, but the organizational requirements. You couldn't just make whiskey and sell it on a street corner. You needed supply chains, distribution networks, relationships with brewers and truckers, and corrupt police officers, and corrupt politicians. You needed, in other words, a system, and you needed someone who could design and manage that system with enough sophistication that it could operate at scale. That someone was Lansky. He worked with Siegel, with Lucky Luciano, with the emerging Italian-American crime families of New York, with operators across the country who understood that the Prohibition era was a moment of organizational creation. In 1929, the major crime figures of the era gathered to create what would eventually be called the National Crime Syndicate, a national organizational framework that divided territory. established rules, and created a structure for managing the financial relationships between its constituent parts. Lansky was not the boss of any of the families at that table. He was not the most feared man in the room, but he was arguably the most important, because he was the one who understood the money. He invented, or rather, refined and industrialized, a set of financial techniques that would shape the global financial system for the next century. The Layered Shell Corporation, the offshore account in a jurisdiction with strong banking secrecy laws, the use of legitimate businesses as vehicles for introducing criminal revenue into the banking system, the casino skim, the systematic removal of cash from gaming operations before it entered the official count, creating revenue that was never recorded and therefore never taxed and never proved. These are not obscure historical curiosities. They are the operating principles of the modern offshore financial system. The Panama Papers documented a system that was, in its essential architecture, identical to what Lansky was building in the 1940s. The cartels that move billions of dollars through the American financial system every year are using techniques that Lansky developed. The dark money organizations that funnel hundreds of millions of dollars into American political campaigns are exploiting structural gaps that Lansky understood before the lawyers who built the legal version of his system were. Lansky was investigated by the FBI for 40 years. They never got him. The architecture he had built was designed specifically to defeat exactly the kind of investigation they were running. When Lansky died in January 1983, investigators examined his estate. They found assets valued at approximately $57,000. The FBI's internal estimate of his actual wealth at the peak of his influence was somewhere in the range of $300 million, equivalent to more than $2 billion in today's money. The gap between those two numbers is where the story lives, where the system lives, where arguably it still lives, because the system did not die with Lansky. The techniques he had refined were adopted by people who had never met him, by institutions that had no connection to organized crime, by a global financial industry that took the basic insight that money, properly structured, can be made legally invisible, and turned it into a mainstream service available to anyone who could afford it. This is why Meyer Lansky matters in 2024, not as a historical figure, not as a colorful footnote to the era of prohibition and the mob, but as the architect of a system that is still running, still moving money, still making the question of who owns what and where it came from as difficult to answer as it was when a small, quiet man was eating breakfast in a Collins Avenue diner while the FBI photographed him from across the street. The system he built outlasted him. It has outlasted every effort to dismantle it. It has been refined and expanded and legalized and constitutionally protected. And it is operating right now in ways that affect your life whether you know it or not. That is why this series exists. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every episode goes one layer deeper. The money never stops moving. Neither do we.